Welcome to Mr. Brown's Basement, a channel devoted to sharing the craft of repairing, restoring, and modifying vintage electronic gear, and other random stuff. Today's video is about my restoration of a Canadian Westinghouse H611-C12 TV radio phonograph. I'd seen this set available on Facebook Marketplace back in August 2021 from a seller in London, Ontario. I knew that it would be heavy and awkward, so I enlisted the help of a friend and we drove all the way to London to pick it up. Honestly, I underestimated how heavy it was. The TV is from between about 1948 and 1950. It was a very expensive set when it first came out. It sports a 12-inch black and white round picture, an AM/FM radio, and a record changer that pulls out in a drawer. The speaker is also attached to that drawer. The original turntable would have been branded Westinghouse, but the one I found was a Glenburn, which is related to BSR, or Birmingham Sound Reproducers, which made literally gazillions of economy turntables and record changers in the 1960s and 70s. It wasn't until I got it to my place that I was able to examine it carefully. One thing that knocked my socks off was the magnifier feature included in this set. But it doesn't just magnify the picture, it also crops the picture with a built-in mechanical shutter. Cool. It needed some lubrication though. The other thing that surprised me was the internal adjustable antenna, which was tuned using a knob under the upper lip of the cabinet. If you didn't know it was there, you'd never find it. Actually, I didn't notice it at first, but when I was inside the set, I noticed a worm drive type mechanism and realized it must be the antenna. The knobs from TVs and radios of this vintage are very hard to find, and I was extremely lucky that all the knobs were intact. One of the first things I do is remove the knobs and put them in a safe place so they don't get lost or broken. They also get a good cleaning because there's nothing quite like 70 years worth of dust and finger grease worked into the grooves to make knobs really disgusting. As you see, this TV only has 12 VHF channels, channels 2 to 13. That's because most areas didn't have any TV stations broadcasting on UHF yet. That is, channels 14 through 83. Yet Westinghouse did call this TV UHF ready because they had an auxiliary tuner to receive the extra channels. Sadly, this TV didn't come with that tuner. I suspect they sold very few of them because even by the 1960s, UHF was largely unused. Getting back to the TV, here's the shutter mechanism for the magnifier feature next to the picture tube. I'm sure it added a lot of extra expense to the TV. Back at the other end of the set is the neck of the picture tube. Tubes of this vintage didn't have an illuminized screen, so ions from the electron gun could, if misaligned, burn out the phosphor of the picture tube face. To control this, there were one, or in this case a pair, of magnets around the picture tube neck called an ion trap. The position and orientation of the ion trap is quite critical and needs to be checked to ensure that it's doing its job. Okay, here's the chassis sitting on the workbench. There are a couple of unusual things about this TV, along with the fact that it uses 30 tubes, including the picture tube, which is a lot. Instead of having an electrode in the gun of the picture tube focusing the electron beam, so-called electrostatic focusing, they use a huge coil called a focusing coil. It's essentially a DC electromagnet and would be obsolete a few years that followed the set. The focusing coil is mounted behind the deflection yoke, so in fact the set has what looks like two yokes. The other unusual thing is the method by which high voltage for the picture tube is derived. In most sets, high voltage for the picture tube comes from the flyback transformer. That is, the transformer involved in getting the electron beam to fly back and forth across the screen. This set predates that design and uses a high-frequency oscillator and something akin to an ignition coil to generate the 10 or so kilovolts for the anode. Looking back on this design, it adds to the complexity and cost of the TV because the horizontal oscillator is only exciting the yoke and not used for anything else. This is the part I'm always dying to see, the underside of the chassis. What have I got myself into? I can see that some components will be very difficult to access, and a few components, like they've been overheated, like that green power resistor in the upper right-hand corner. On a set like this, the tubes must be tested and then the chassis needs to be recapped, replacing the electrolytic and paper capacitors before applying power. Of the 30 tubes, most were branded Westinghouse, probably originals. About 10 were dead. There were, however, many capacitors that needed to be replaced, and an unreadable layout diagram. As I started methodically working through the chassis, to make it easier for me to see where I had been and where I was going, I used red spaghetti insulation on new parts. I also installed terminal strips wherever possible to tidy up the mess. It was also while testing resistors along the way I discovered about half the carbon composition resistors were unacceptably out of tolerance and had to be replaced. As is often the case in an old set, you find the legacy of someone else's poor workmanship. In this case, I touched a tube socket and it literally fell apart. That's because the contacts must have been bent and rebent so many times that metal fatigue had caused it to fail. Yeah, that's about 2 hours of work to fix that one. When I was almost finished, I found there were a bunch of capacitors in the high voltage circuit I could not find. And that's because they were hidden, mounted underneath the high voltage cage, which had to be removed from below. This also gave me a chance to clean up the carbon tracks around the high voltage rectifier. Long Q-tips and lots of pure alcohol does wonders, but you can't leave it. Carbon tracks will cause arcing. And of course there are a few capacitors which are really hard to locate because they were hiding behind other components, like this one. At this point I was ready to try powering up the set, and I did through a variac. After a mishap with one resistor which gave its life in the performance of its duty, and after doing an alignment, I was able to get a picture. A decent picture, both non-magnified and magnified, but no sound. It seemed the sound signal was stopping at a transformer and going no further. The transformer tested good for continuity, which means that the signal was getting mangled in another way. I decided to take the chance of removing the transformer and opening it up, and looking at the pattern capacitors inside, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears: silver mica capacitor rot disease. So I put the transformer back together and got a couple 50 picofarad mica capacitors and mounted them outside the transformer, and guess what? I have sound.
I want to sit here and make some paper hats for this gay party we seem to be having.
After one last look at the bottom of the chassis, it was ready to be put back into the cabinet. But first I had to Windex all the glass surfaces and lubricate the shutter mechanism. It's no exaggeration to say that it was a beast to get it back into the cabinet, but it was worth it.
That you can use, I'm sure there will be. I'll leave you to distribute them fairly. Well, I've got to run.
Yeah, run right in that brick wall out there.
The video is actually better in person than it is on the camera. And what about the turntable? The original turntable was seized, so I got an inexpensive BSR turntable, which was better, and I put that in instead. It wasn't worth the trouble to try and fix the old one. I did have to buy a small preamp for the magnetic cartridge in the new turntable, and I hid it discreetly in the cabinet. And I had to fix a few scratches here and there and repair the veneer. But other than that, there wasn't a lot of work on the cabinet. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up and perhaps even subscribing to this channel for more interesting videos. That's all for today. Thanks again for watching.